Hello all, welcome to TechWithShas. In this video, we will talk about API Gateway. API Gateway is a critical component of microservices architecture. It acts as a front door to our backend APIs or backend applications. Clients exchange their data via API gateway with our backend APIs or our backend applications. So let us understand why it is important and how it is used. So suppose you are developing an e-commerce application and as a backend developer, you develop many APIs, for example, a product API, a search API, order API, and profile API of customer. So all these API contract maybe in JSON or some other language, you have to share it with the web developer. So they will be developing their application on like basically using the Angular API, Angular UI, Angular language, or maybe JavaScript, right? So they are going to utilize these APIs and contract to render the data onto the UI. But for example, what happens that there is some business change happened, and now your customer base is basically broken down into the corporate and also in the individual customer base. So now you will split your profile API into two APIs. So now this change is also going to impact your UI side. So uh, this developer has to update the UI code or maybe change the URLs, whatever rendering is required, it is to be done. So what happened here basically? So because all these APIs are tightly coupled with the UI application, so any small change in the contract or maybe in any APIs is going to impact the UI very hard. So how do we solve this, right? So that the changes which are going to happen or they are bound to happen because of the ever changing business requirement, right? So you want to abstract away these changes from the UI component or any consuming component, right? So the answer is the API gateway. So when you use this API gateway, you can basically, so this web application is going to interact with the API gateway. It is not bothered about any API changes, what is happening inside your backend API side. So whatever request is going to send is going to reach to API gateway, and API gateway is going to route the request according to the request from the web. So basically, API gateway is acting as a abstraction layer. So whatever the tight coupling we had seen in the previous example, that led to change in the UI side heavily because of even a small change in the backend side that is going away, because API gateway component is going to sit in between your client or maybe your consuming application and the backend services. So this is very helpful component in terms of routing the request to the correct API in the backend side. Also, API gateway is also a component, right? It basically configures these requests or these APIs like a get output request. Then whenever a request arrives to API gateway, it will abstract away and route to the correct API. So basically, API gateway is basically, you can understand as it's a abstraction, which is basically helping to us to decouple the backend and the front end services in a very simplistic manner. So now let us understand like what other capabilities API gateway provides us. Like what are the capabilities we use it for our application. So for example, you have a client like mobile, the desktop and on the UI, right? Maybe a browser, and you want to access the various services in the backend that like REST services which are consuming from the database, right? So what you will do, you will add a API gateway in between them. This API gateway will provide many capabilities such as authentication, authorization. Suppose you have a client request coming from a mobile browser, right? So you want to make sure that the client which want to access your backend services is the right one. So maybe API gateway will call some component that is going to check about authentication, authorization about those things and make sure that the request is legitimate. Then it will also provide this security policy enforcement. So suppose you have some specific requirement of having some security policies configured, maybe because you are a bank or some other customer. So at that time, you can configure these security policies in the API gateway, and also you can enforce at runtime. Then another capability is load balancing. So suppose you have many instances of REST APIs running, right? So you want to make sure that the load is going to the every cluster properly. Maybe if one cluster is doing heavy lifting, the other is just like very light. So it is not good because that create bottlenecks in our system, right? So it might have some latency issues in the client side. So for that the load balancing capability is also provided by the API gateway, so it can route the traffic to the correct APIs or clusters properly. Then rate limiting, right? So suppose you have capability of servicing 10 requests per millisecond, but the requests are coming as a higher rate, maybe at 20 or 30 requests per millisecond, so that you know that you cannot fulfill those requests, and that might bring down your whole application. So to make sure that application is performing well and there is no issue. So what we do, we have to basically drop those requests. That is called rate limiting. So whenever we have a certain requirement, like okay, the system can fulfill these many requests, but beyond that, if it goes, then we have to drop those requests. That is basically a rate limiting. That can be configured in API gateway as well. Another capability is a circuit breaker. So circuit breaker, I will not go much detail because I already made two videos on that. So please look my architectural pattern videos that will give you a good understanding. Now, like we have this result termination. So any communication which is happening over web is encrypted. So whenever a request coming to the API gateway is encrypted, it's not like a plain text, right? For security reasons. So if API gateway is passed, that request directly to the API is in the backend. But the overhead for them because every API has to decrypt that request and then fulfill it, right? So for that, API gateway will intercept that request, decrypt it, and send in the correct format in the backend API. So backend APIs can properly process that request. So this is also a critical requirement, and it can be fulfilled by the API gateway. Another capability is protocol translation. So suppose you have requests coming as HTTP, but you want to process them as a gRPC, so that you can also configure in the API gateway. It's possible to do that. Then we have a service discovery. So sometime, suppose you are adding some new services, or maybe you are changing some URLs or some contract. So that can be configured in API gateway, and API gateway can correctly route the request to the correct API. So capability is also configurable in the API gateway end. Another capability is like logging, I mean monitoring also, because the monitoring is something like you have to monitor the request, what nature of request and their size, and whatever things you want to monitor, you can do that in API gateway. That is configurable based on the client requirement. And billing as well. Suppose you have some APIs which are monetized and you are charging your client maybe per request basis. So at that time, you need to know that, okay, how much requests are being fulfilled from your APIs in the backend, so that you can do that capture. You can capture that in your API gateway, and also you can do billing for that. Then logging, like whatever requests are coming or responses are going, any errors, any issues, you can log them, and that's going to be very helpful in terms of debugging any issues which may arise in a later side of the functioning of application. Then analytics also, because every request is being fulfilled via API gateway. So API gateway can also do some analytics, and maybe it can give you some customer insights or customer patterns, right? How we are behaving against the request and what are the various things we can improve. So those things also can be done by API gateway. Caching as well, because uh, maybe some services are being called frequently and the response will not be change a lot of time. So you can also cache those responses, and API gateway need not to call API in the backend for every such request, and they can fulfill from API gateway itself. So these were the various capabilities which API gateway provides. Now let us understand what API gateway do. I mean, so we understand, okay, what API gateway does when it gets a request. So suppose, for example, you have these clients, right, like a mobile browser or desktop, and you get a request, right, to a API gateway. So API gateway is going to first validate a request. Okay, request is fine or not, because there will be some rules configured already in the API gateway to verify that request is valid or some other issue. So it will check the validation of a request. Then it will basically check the ECL, like access control list. So suppose there are some APIs or some client which are already being stopped from accessing your application. So those IPs will be checked by API gateway so that only the legal customers can move ahead and access their system. Then we have security policies, like I said earlier. So if any security policy you want to configure, those will be checked here for every request to be fulfilled by the backend APIs. Then we have same thing like encryption, decryption will be happening. So data which is coming as an encrypted form, that is going to be decrypted and sent back to the backend APIs. Then we will have rate limiting. So it will check, okay, what is the current rate of request, are we able to fulfill those or not? If not, let's drop few requests, right? To make sure our system is up and down, up and running, right? So that is basically that limiting part which we configure in the API gateway. Then it's going to do the routing. So whatever request it has to fulfill from any particular API, that it has to discover from the service catalog and route to the correct API, right? To fulfill the request from client. Then yes, the same thing like discover the service and whatever endpoints we need to fulfill those things, it has to basically find out and perform that. Then we have the protocol translation if required. Suppose you have changing some protocols in between, those can be done. And apart from these, like we have other handling capabilities. These are like ongoing for every request. Monitoring is also ongoing, is logging and analytics. So these are some capabilities which API gateway provides. So the sequence what I have told is not maybe same sequence, but yeah, somehow it will give an idea to you that okay, this is the some steps which are performed by the API gateway, and how it is helping the services to offload these functionalities from it to the API gateway, so that the APIs or developers can focus on the business logic rather than worrying about the request validation or security policy or the some other things, right? So it's basically a really great component in terms of Microsoft architecture. So yeah, in conclusion, that the API gateway is a API management tool that sits between the client and the collection of backend services that, as I explained earlier, and also whatever request comes to the your application, that are going to be basically passed via the API gateway, and then it will perform some kind of logic or rules which are pre-configured. Then it is going to pass those requests to the backend API. So in a nutshell, API gateway is a very critical component in terms of Microsoft architecture. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Please leave comments or questions if you have any. Please subscribe my video if you like it. Thank you very much.